Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts. And every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black everything, everything black. Culture over everything, y'all. We taking it back.
Welcome to Left to Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We are joined today by Professor Bianca C. Williams, an Associate Professor of Anthropology, Critical Psychology, and Women and Gender Studies at the CUNY Graduate Center. She's the author of the award-winning book, The Pursuit of Happiness, Black Women, Diasporic Dreams, and the Politics of Emotional Transnationalism, published by Duke University Press in 2018. And she's also the co-editor of Plantation, Politics and Campus Rebellions, Power, Diversity, and the Emancipatory Struggle in Higher Education with Deanne Squire and Frank Tuitt, published by our friends at Suny Press 2021. And we're also joined by Professor Armond R. Towns, Associate Professor in Communication and Media Studies at Carleton University. He's the author of the just published on Black Media Philosophy, published by the University of California Press, and he is a contributor to Plantation, Politics and Campus Rebellions with the essay Inclusion and Equal Racial Violence, Time, Space, and the Afterlife of the Plantation. How are you both doing today?
Doing well. Thank you for having us, and thank you for having me back.
Yes.
Doing very well.
Of Plantation, Politics, and Campus Rebellions, Ms. Magazine writes, this collection of essays is a timely and vital contribution to the examination of race in higher education. These are hard-hitting essays from an extraordinary slate of contributors. Bianca, talk a little bit about the genesis of this project.
So personally, it actually started with Frank. Frank Tuitt was Chief Executive Diversity Officer at the University of Denver. And at the time, Armond also worked there. And Frank, when the movement for Black Lives started across the country, particularly the campus rebellions on university campuses, he was trying to navigate, negotiate, process the feelings that he was having as an administrator that was both responsible for equity and diversity on campus, but then being asked to kind of like get the students in line, to calm down. He felt like repress the actual resistance that was happening on campus. At the same time, he was watching Underground, that great show that got canceled before we know what happened. He was watching Underground and really connecting with some of the feelings and sentiments that Cato, the person who was responsible for re-enslaving his own people, like trying to negotiate this kind of, I want to help fuel the rebellions, and I'm also being asked by the institution to repress them. And so in the book, he has a chapter on Chief Executive Diversity Officers and how their responsibilities are connected to the drivers on plantations, right? The Black men who were responsible for keeping enslaved peoples in line. And while he was navigating that, I was at the University of Colorado Boulder as a person who had just submitted their tenure file. So I was under like high review, and also co-founder and co-lead of the Denver chapter of Black Lives Matter. And so trying to figure out how to negotiate being a very public organizer in Denver, where my students would show up at actions, but then on campus also feeling like as a Black faculty member, I was responsible for kind of shutting down the resistance that was happening as I was perpetuating resistance and organizing resistance in Denver. And so, and Deanne was a postdoc at the University of Denver at the time. And so we got together a team of graduate students and postdocs to analyze the demands that were coming from universities, particularly that Black students from across the country, or really around the world, were making demands of their institutions to make campuses not more welcoming, but like equitable and to get justice on campus. And we brought this group of students together to analyze demands that were coming out of that moment. And at the end of it, what we decided and what we heard was that taking Black folks' vernacular of plantation politics, I mean, I went to Duke, you work at Duke. We hear all the time in Durham, people call Duke the plantation, right? What would it mean to actually take that seriously and to create a framework of plantation politics that allows us to understand the ways that current day institutions are connected to this history of plantations, and the ways that people in current universities are using some of the same tools or tools that come from those roots of white supremacy during plantation time to repress campus rebellions that are happening on campus. So we hope the framework is useful in a sense that it allows people to understand how higher ed institutions work better, how they exploit Black labor, exploit Black people, how they perpetuate white supremacy, and begin to use the framework of plantation politics and campus rebellions to do better organizing within higher ed.
So what do you say to folks? Like I'm thinking about William C. Rhoden's great book from a decade ago, $40 Million Slaves, right? And we know that the NBA was so concerned with this idea of people owning teams and owning bodies that owners are now governors instead of owners. What do you say to folks? And Armond, you can jump into this also, that a plantation framework is really too much. To make that comparison between, faculty and staff, but also, low wage staff, at these institutions, and aligning it with a framework of plantation politics might in fact be too much.
So what's interesting is that when we started this project in 2015, we actually, the three of us, the editors, had a conversation with one another about what we were willing to risk by working on this project, because we felt like a lot of people would feel as though the framework of plantation politics was too much, right? And I think Dan, as the postdoc, as a person who wasn't already on the tenure track, kind of paid the most in some ways, being blocked off from jobs because of talking about plantation politics publicly. So I think it's interesting because in this moment of talk about abolition of white supremacy, plantation politics actually doesn't seem that radical or drastic, because we have shifted politically in the last 5 to 8 years drastically. So I think plantation politics actually sounds pretty calm and tame right now, and kind of as a given. If you paid attention to any of the histories of these institutions, these white supremacist institutions that we work in, you will see that plantation politics is kind of a given for how the university works. I'd love to hear what Armond thinks.
Yeah, I think the thing that really strikes me about the connection between the plantation and the university is thinking about epistemology most specifically. I'm thinking particularly about what are the terms that we get from the plantation. So I'm thinking a lot of the work of people like Ronald Judy and the Negro as a construct really kind of strikes me. And you think about, that article he has on Kant and the Negro, right? And he says that there's this anthropological connection that Kant creates when he starts to talk about this construct of the Negro, right? So then you got anthropology in there, right? You have a very particular structure that's connected to the university. Of course, you have the plantation itself, right? The buying and selling of land, the growing of materials, right? All of that, then you can get into the discussion of economics, right? We can kind of connect this to various different epistemological frameworks. So I'm really interested in thinking about what is the connection between the plantation and knowledge, right? And how that also plays a part in the constructs of the university.
And Mark, I want to be clear, because I make this point often. We're not saying that Black folks in higher ed are enslaved currently, right? We would never, ever connect the complicated choices and the various forces of oppression that we are navigating in higher ed with those that our ancestors survived, had to live through, right? But I think there are connections, and Dean's chapter in particular, talking about the mechanisms of social control and the various forms of order the institutions try to create. Some of those things are connected to this previous moment.
You just mentioned, Bianca, the reputation that Duke has as a plantation. Duke is a relatively young university. The Duke family actually didn't own slaves, right? So that reputation is almost wholly built on relationships that the university has had with people who live, in the city, Black people who live in the city of Durham. Armond, the relationship to your graduate institution, UNC, to slavery and and plantations are a little bit more legible to us. For both of you, how much did your experiences at these universities, as graduate students for you, Armond, you, of course, were also an undergraduate student and a graduate student at Duke, Bianca, how much of those experiences really informed the work that you do now and think about in terms of the politics of the university?
Yeah, I mean, I talk about this in my chapter a bit, but the kind of relationship of Chapel Hill to the plantation is no secret, right? So I think that in particular, one of the things that I am really interested in is thinking about how an institution like Chapel Hill replicates the longer kind of colonial plantation legacy that it's built off of. I think you can see that in the continual the politics of North Carolina that we see today, right? That is like really kind of coming at the University of Chapel Hill. You can see that in the long held kind of attack on the African American Studies Department at Chapel Hill. There are various different kind of long held kind of racial politics that we see in Chapel Hill. And I don't think you can disconnect that from its connection to plantation politics. As a student there, I think that I always kind of, my family is from the North Carolina area. And particularly the area around Chapel Hill. I always think about like the various different buildings that are still on campus that were built by slaves, right? Contracted out by the university to bring in slaves to build various different buildings, right? So I mean, it's a very kind of intimate relationship, right? To walk around a campus like that. And know that that's the history of it. And then to navigate those politics on a daily basis is interesting, let's say that. I'll stop there.
Yeah, similarly. I was at Duke for 11 years as an undergrad and a graduate student. So I have a good amount of rich data to extract from, different presidencies, different shifts in administrators and faculty. And I'll just say for me, the campus rebellions part of this project is really important because Duke is where I learned how to be an organizer, where I learned how to be an activist. It was that experience that Armond is talking about of being in this space where you're like, something is happening to me and I'm being hailed in particular ways. I don't understand what's going on. And I joke with my students, I spent more time in meetings with administrators and planning, various forms of rebellion and resistance than I probably did in class, which, probably wasn't great, but I learned very well how institutions work. It was part of my education of learning how white supremacy is a motor, a driver of the education business of what institutions profit off of and how they see and view Black people within those institutions. And so I would say that my organizing with BLM, my organizing even after BLM probably wouldn't have happened without my experiences at university. And part of what we argue in the intro is that this project is partly about what conditions create these campus rebellions that we keep seeing decade after decade, generation after generation, right? When you look at the demands of the students from this particular moment of the movement for Black lives and compare them to the demands of the 1960s and 1970s, they're not drastically different, right? Even with the millions and millions and millions of dollars of investment that institutions have made to create equity and diversity and inclusion initiatives. So something about the institution, the roots of white supremacy is creating the conditions for this type of, rebellions and resistance.
Armond, your contribution to the collection, if I'm reading it correctly, you make a really nuanced argument about the reality of so-called people of color, Black exclusion from the academy. in that you argue that in the Academy's anti-Black racism and settler colonialism, and the idea of Western constructs of knowledge, right? The clear reference are Black folks, right? So you can't construct these things without some reference to Black people, even as the university is arguing Black people aren't on the landscape, right? This is about including Black people. You argue that no, it's always included Black people in its exclusion, right? Could you talk a little bit about your contribution?
Yeah, definitely. I think that, my view on this really builds out of the Black studies tradition, particularly, thinking like Sylvia Wynter, Charles Long. You can kind of find this throughout various different trends of Black studies. And the thing that I think really kind of continually sticks out to me is that these kind of Western constructs that are called knowledge are really kind of fragmenting the world, especially in this kind of, post 19th century moment, the establishment of disciplines, of academic disciplines. You start to see then the real kind of fabrication of sciences distinct from the humanities, right? Whereas, previous times, you just had like natural history, right? And it was kind of all like a mix of various different types of forms of knowledge. Once you get to that late 19th century era, you really start to see this fabrication. So that's the moment that I'm really interested in, I think, in this chapter, where you start to see that science has a monopoly on these questions of space. And then history being this kind of question of the humanities, pulling out of Hegel. So those two constructs really kind of organize the way that I think about that chapter, and how, Hegel's argument that the Negro has no history, and that then organizes the humanities, and the scientific argument of examining objective space and objects. And that also is, again, going back to this kind of anthropological narrative of what the Negro is supposed to be. So even in their, fabrication of the Negro is not included, it's always a part of it, right? Now, that's not Black people, right? These are objects, right? These are fabrications, right? This is not a kind of nuanced understanding of Black people, but it is a Western fabrication that assumes that we're not there when we're actually really central to it.
Bianca, you mentioned in the introduction that this project really begins to coalesce in 2015, right? And this is a culmination of a really odd period in American history, right? We know it by hashtags like I too am, Black Lives Matter. We look in a global context. We actually, have to factor fees must fall, into this conversation. But it also is occurring, right, in what are, the first 7 years of the presidency of the first Black American to be elected president of the United States. What do you think this political energy in that moment said about how young folks, particularly college students, were thinking about, this first Black American president?
Oh, so much. So I begin that intro with a scene of us being at, I can't remember which conference it was now, which education conference, but literally we're presenting on plantation politics and campus rebellion the day after the election of Donald Trump, right? And feeling like the project was really important before that day, right? Like we would present at conferences, and people who worked in student affairs would come to us at the end in tears, like, thank you for at least naming something that we've been feeling effectively, that like it gives us a kind of an anchor for some of the conversations that we need to have with administrators and our institution about what we're experiencing and the ways we're being exploited within this space. So even before that, we were getting kind of really emotional responses to the work. But that day, feeling like, both, is this work even important because we have reached a new moment of just terribleness politically around anti-Blackness and white supremacy, and feeling like the work was even more important post that day, right? So I think in this moment, the movement for Black Lives, young folks in particular have not only found language, but are finding new spaces for theory making and really being able to analyze the institutions and oppressions that they're being positioned within, right? And so the thing that's inspiring to me about the last 7 years in this terrible moment, it's ongoing period of, violence, of exploitation, are the ways that young folks are beginning to name and move collectively in this moment. And I'm inspired by my students. My students teach me all the time about how the shifting needle of even what's radical, right? Like the things, again, that we thought were important when I was in grad school. I remember us fighting forever about like inclusion, and that was a thing that we wanted, right? And they're like, we don't need that. Give us the money, give us the power to make decisions, and we will figure out our own way of educating ourselves and creating knowledge, right? So I really appreciate the young folks, and I appreciate the contributors in this volume, particularly chapters like Armond, that are really making us think about how deeply these ideas and mechanisms are embedded in the things that we take for granted, like disciplines, the ways that institutions decide to educate people, that these things are so embedded. And I think in this moment, we're seeing people begin to tease apart those things that we take for granted.
Armond?
Yeah, when Bianca was talking, I was really thinking also about like the some of the differences, I think, between kind of like those like 1960s protests in particular and today, right? And that kind of really makes me think about like the work of like Jody Malamed and Roderick Ferguson, right? And like the what I see both of them as saying is this kind of like narrative of inclusion and diversity really kind of comes out of that post-60s moment, right? You start to see particularly the increase of like the post-Nixon Black capitalist argument, right? Of like, we'll move more middle-class Black people into positions of power, into higher education. And then from that, we'll kind of take these narratives of diversity and inclusion, and let's leave behind that Black radical stuff, right? Like that Black study stuff, that's too much, right? And we'll shift now into this kind of 80s, 90s, 2000s diversity, equity, inclusion type of narrative, and as if they're like completely distinct and separate, right? So I'm really interested, I think, in kind of connecting those moments, right? So that we know like, where does diversity, equity, and inclusion come from? And how are they different? How is it different? And how is it, kind of building off of a particular older narrative?
And I think there's a way that we're seeing, I don't know if we're seeing the last gasp of white supremacy. People keep saying that. I don't know that that's true. But I do think that people are, that Black folks who have been having these analyses for forever, there's now a mainstream conversation about how we're not going to fall for the okie doke, right? Like we're not going to just stop at this point. Like we're actually going to keep pushing to the next point, and to create new futures and new radical futures that we haven't been able to even imagine, to have space and resources to do that type of work. And so I think what we're seeing is the response to people being like, we gave you this much and we thought you would be happy for it. We thought you would be grateful for it, right? We see that in some of Armond's chapter. We thought you would be happy to be here. And suddenly you're asking for more. And so I think the violence that we're seeing, the response that we're seeing around CRT, all these things like going backwards in time are because people are realizing that we're not just going to stop at like this. Right. We're actually moving past that point.
We're the last couple of years, right, where because of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, we're like in this moment of racial reckoning. And I'm going to editorialize a bit for a moment. Because on the one hand, when institutions, to begin to go through their process of how they were going to respond to this moment, those of us who've been doing this work for a long time, we know there's going to be a clapback. Right. And the clapback, of course, is the attacks on CRT, even if it's not CRT. And we also know that institutions, will move more so at the fear of the clapback than they will from doing the right thing in the first place. The second thing, of course, is that, if you didn't have the financial resources to address these issues prior to 2020, what would make us think that you suddenly would have those resources in the midst of a global pandemic? Right. So it always felt like a kind of false narrative, right? And you talk about this, right? The false promises of diversity and inclusion. But one of the things that's occurred in this moment is what I'll call the rise of the DEI class. So every institution now, right, has a DEI officer, right? Corporate entities, hell, Warner Brothers, right, hired a DEI officer to do this kind of work, right? And it raises a couple of questions. One, if you do that job for 10 years, what the hell do you do next? Right. So even the title of the job locks you in to a certain kind of class, like that. If you aspire to be a provost or a dean or a president, right, you're kind of locked into these kind of positions. And I want to shout out Carla Holloway, who's always talked about this, right, in terms of these kind of positions. But what do you think this role now is for this new DEI class? And what do we do about the kind of false promises of inclusion and diversity that even 2 years out, universities are now wavering on, in terms of a real commitment?
Okay, I'll take a stab at that. I think the thing I think that's interesting about the kind of DEI class, right, as you're calling it, is I'm also interested in like what are their salaries, right?
How much money are they making?
How much money you make to be a DEI warrior, right? Like, I think Frank kind of talks about this, especially like kind of in our like interpersonal conversations, but also like in our some of the panels we've sat on together. But one of the things that he really kind of makes me think about is like the way in which the kind of DEI officer becomes really a way for the university to not deal with any issues, right? So it's like, now let's put like a Black or brown face here that becomes the face of the university whenever there's any type of, issue that pops up. So the DEI officer kind of becomes a stopgap, right? As a way of really trying to prevent any type of student protest, right? So we'll come and we'll protest with you, right? We'll come and we'll kind of take your demands and put them into this one kind of officer. I don't know if there's like a direct answer to what to do with that. But I do think that, it's interesting to think about, one, how much they're getting paid. And two, also what is their function, right? What is the role that they're asked to play by the institution? And I think, those are good places to start to think about, well, what do we do now?
What do you think about scholars and faculty that have been hired at universities to specifically do anti-Black racism, right, training, in a way that which, most of us who do this work, we do Black studies, right? Embedded in Black studies is, work that addresses anti-Black racism. Right. No one, well, there are a few people, but no one calls himself an anti-Black racist scholar. Talk a little bit about folks who are now locked into, and often junior folks, right, who are locked in this kind of new positions that seem like positions to nowhere.
I mean, I think, what's so interesting about that question to me is, my own research is kind of looking at what's the relationship between the history of Black studies and communication studies, which are two academic disciplines that really emerge around the same time. 1960s, their kind of introduction into the university. And what I find really interesting about that question is the kind of almost overemphasis on race and racism today, right? Whereas, there's this book, and I'm drawing a blank on the name of the book, but, thinking about how, the kind of move to Black away from Negro is this kind of move away from let's only focus on race, let's actually focus on political power, right? Let's focus on radicalism, right? And now today, the word Black is just race, right? Like, it's kind of been removed from that political history, right? And I try to get my students to think about that, like, how did that happen, right? So I think it's interesting that, the kind of DEI officer is also kind of a part of that, right? Like this kind of reduction of Black studies to race studies is kind of a part of that. And I think that there's got to be a little more nuanced in thinking about, what actually was being stated kind of in those early comments on Black studies, and how, whether or not we're still kind of in that moment, right? In terms of like what the kind of correct, I don't know if I can even call it a correct role or not, right? Like that people take when they take on these DEI positions, because I think that, I think in general, people probably take it because they want to help somebody, right? Like they're not taking it because they think they're like, like trying to sell anybody out, right? They're taking it because they believe that they can kind of motivate and move people. But I think that, like most institutions, it becomes a lot clearer when you get in that position that that's not actually what's happening, right? Yeah. So I think that's another thing to think about.
Questions about whether or not a DEI person has a direct line to the president in terms of the president's ear, in terms of reporting, and even more so than how much they're making, right? What kind of resources are they actually equipped with in terms of money to actually do things,
right?
In terms of hiring lines and pushing departments to think more broadly about how they bring in. It's often where those positions, folks come to the realization that they don't actually have much power and influence in that context. While I have you, Armond, talk a little bit about your new book. And we're definitely going to have you back to talk about it at length. But if you could talk just a little bit about your book that just got published on Black media philosophy.
Yeah, I mean, it really goes back to, I think, some of the stuff I've been talking about, and this relationship between the history of media and communication studies and Black studies. And in particular, what I do in that book is I look at the development of Canadian media studies, particularly the work of Marshall McLuhan, and how that form of media studies really kind of is viewed as central to implementing a materialist reading of media. But, like we've been saying, right, like the way that McLuhan does that is through a very kind of anthropological, social Darwinian lens, which then reads all Black people as merely derivatives of white people, right? Like we're white people's past, like they've moved on from their tribal past and they have developed and civilized these things. So, that's one part of the book, but the more important part to me is the way that Black people have constantly been media makers ourselves, and how the terms and the theories that McLuhan believes are kind of the terms and theories of Western society have long been utilized and pushed forward by Black people. So I'm really interested in thinking about, the relationship between Black studies in particular and that kind of media studies moment, and pushing in kind of two different directions. I think one, understanding the Western side, and the other, understanding the Black decolonial perspective.
What's next for you, Bianca?
I'm gonna work on a book on pedagogy, organizing, and radical honesty. Trying to make sense of and process the experience of teaching during the movement for Black Lives while organizing with my chapter of BLM in Denver, in an effort to kind of think about pedagogy as organizing and the various ways that Black feminist pedagogy has been making change and waves and new ways of thinking and producing knowledge in higher ed, but also thinking about organizing as pedagogy and the ways that organizing teaches us and allows us to learn new ways of being and thinking. And radical honesty being the kind of Black feminist truth telling that I think is central to that pedagogy and organizing. I think there's a canon of Black feminist organizing praxis out there. And I want to bring all that together, particularly because the young folks have been using it so well in the past 8 years.
I thought about your formulation of radical honesty. I'm watching the reboot of Bel Air, the reboot of the first one, and they're sitting there, Aunt Viv and sitting there. Well, let's have a moment of radical honesty. I was like, oh.
Yes. I mean, there is a book on radical honesty. I think he is a psychologist from maybe over 15 years ago. But I am thinking about it a little differently from a Black feminist kind of genealogy, and really centering the movement for Black lives and how people have been organizing and teaching within higher ed and these organizing spaces and bringing them together. This assumed disconnect between higher ed, the academy, and organizing more broadly is really interesting to me. And so I'm trying to kind of deconstruct that disconnect.
We've been joined today by Professor Bianca C. Williams, Associate Professor of Anthropology, Critical Psychology, and Women and Gender Studies at the CUNY Graduate Center. She's the author of the award-winning book, The Pursuit of Happiness, Black Women, Diasporic Dreams and the Politics of Emotional Transnationalism, Duke 2018. She's a co-editor of Plantation Politics and Campus Rebellions, Power, Diversity, and Emancipatory Struggle in Higher Education with Deanne Squire and Frank Tuitt, Suny Press 2021. Bianca, of course, is a Duke University alum, DDMF. Armond Towns, Associate Professor in Communication and Media Studies at Carleton University in Ontario. He's the author of the just published Black Media Philosophy, published by the University of California Press. His contribution to Plantation Politics and Campus Rebellions is the essay Inclusion Equals Racial Violence, Time, Space, and the Afterlife of the Plantation. Thank you both for taking time to talk with me and us on Left of Black today.
Thanks for having us. I appreciate it.
Thank you for having us, and go get Armond's book.
Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts, and every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black everything, everything black, culture over everything.